Once again, we'll turn to John chapter 12. We'll read verse 20 and verse 21. And there were certain Greeks among them that came up to worship at the feast. Remember, it's the Passover feast. The same, these Greeks, came therefore to Philip, which was of Bethsaida of Galilee, and desired him, saying, Sir, we would see Jesus. I want to take the thought of the message from the expressed desire of these Greeks. We would see Jesus. And I want to consider it in connection with what took place in the house of Simon the leper that we read of earlier. Again, our text here begins with certain Greeks, that is, Gentiles. These had come to Jerusalem for the Passover. We're not told who they are. It appears that they were Gentiles who had come to believe, at the very least, in the Hebrew religion. And these, in verse 21, came to Philip saying, Sirs, we would see Jesus. That was their desire. We're also told in verse 21 that Philip, though he was a Jew, was of Bethsaida of Galilee, which was a Gentile region, and probably the reason these Greeks or Gentiles went to him. It also suggests that they knew him, and it also suggests that he had been a testimony to them. They knew he knew Jesus. And again, they say to Philip, Sir, we would see Jesus. Philip, perhaps not sure how to answer them, verse 22, he went and told Andrew. And we learn from John 1, verse 44, that Andrew was also of Bethsaida. And Philip comes to Andrew saying there's certain Greeks and they want to see Jesus. No doubt Philip and Andrew consult, and then the two of them together, verse 22, went and told Jesus, there are certain Gentiles or certain Greeks that want to see you. And then we read in verse 23, and Jesus answered them. That is, Philip and Andrew, and probably in the hearing of the other apostles. And from verse 29, we read that there were others standing there as well. The people, therefore, that stood by and heard it. So this was said in the hearing of many. We do not know the motivation of these certain Greeks to see Jesus. And though we do not know their motive, nor do we know the degree of their desire, this should always be our desire as a saved people, to see Jesus Christ. Whether it be in our private and individual lives, or whether it be when we come to the house of God. Our aspiration, our yearning ought to be to see Jesus. In Hebrews 2, verse 9, we read how we need to see Him. Notice, if we turn over there, Hebrews chapter 2. We'll be back in John 12, but Hebrews 2. We see how we need to see Him. But we see Jesus. who was made a little lower than the angels. So we need to see Him incarnate, coming from the glories of heaven to this sin-cursed earth. And this for the suffering of death. He came. We need to see Him coming to lay down His life for us. Need to see Him willing to be found guilty and condemned for us. Never has one stooped so low. We need to see Him. We need to see Him victorious. Hebrews 2 verse 9, crowned with glory and honor, conquering all that stood in the way, sin, Satan, death, and the grave. And we need to see Him with regard to the grace of God, that by the grace of God, He should taste death for every man. That's how we need to see Jesus. Hopefully we can identify with those words, Hebrews 2 verse 9, we see Jesus. A continual seeing of Jesus that impacts our life, that impacts our manner of living in a very powerful and transforming way. So we want to speak this morning on seeing Jesus in a life-impacting way. So let's go back to John chapter 12. We see Christ's instruction concerning these who want to see Him. We see His response. They expressed their desire we would see Jesus. And the response of Jesus is seen in verses 23 through 27. And again, it must be taken in the context of we would see Jesus. This is what we see here in verses 23 through verse 27 is information with relation to we would see Jesus. He was telling them in His response that they needed to see Him by faith. Verse 23, Jesus answered them, the hour's come that the Son of Man should be glorified. His response to Peter and Andrew, telling him of these Greeks who desire to see Him, the hour has come, relating to a fixed, definite, and determined time. That is, the appointed fixed time has come. And then He proceeds that the Son of Man should be glorified. And though in His answer He would speak of Christ's death, verse 33, this He said signifying what death He should die. So though He's speaking of Christ's death, where does He begin? He begins by speaking of His glory. So this has reference, His glory has reference to His resurrection, to His ascension, to Him sitting at the right hand of God. It has reference to His ultimate victory. He then proceeds, verse 24, to illustrate from a general principle of nature. He says, when the seed is planted, it dies, it becomes fruitful. The grain becomes the blade, then the ear, then the full corn in the ear. Christ is speaking of life through His death. Again, we must see Christ by faith. This would all be by faith. He's speaking of victory. He's speaking of glorification. Well, what does that have to do with Philip and Andrew? Jesus is saying these Greeks, these Gentiles, must see Me, not merely in earthly physical form, They must see me in glorification and victory. Now, in order to be saved, man must see more than a historical Jesus that lived upon this earth. In order to be saved, in order for the saved individual to live a victorious life, they must see more than a historical Christ. They must see Christ risen and glorified. And that's what Jesus is saying here. Jesus is saying that these Greeks who desired to see Him needed more than to just see Him with the physical eye. They must see me by faith, risen and glorified. How do we see Him today? He was also telling them that they needed to see Him in a way that impacts their life. In verses 25, in verse 26, he says, "He that loveth his life shall lose it. He that hateth his life in this world shall keep it unto life eternal. If any man serve me, let him follow me. And where I am, there also my servant be. If any man serve me, him will my Father honor." Again, this is still in response to we would see Jesus. And now he shifts in his response from the glorification of Christ, he shifts to a life lived for Christ. I believe that he speaks these words as a warning to the apostles. Remember, they had just witnessed the palms, the people waving the palms in his path, and the echoes of the people's hosannas were still ringing in their ears. In just a few days, they would hear, "Crucify him, crucify him." But these were not to be the things that moved them. Again, remember, this is his response to the Gentiles saying we would see Jesus. And what Jesus says in verse 25 and 6 relate to that. Sirs, we would see Jesus. So I believe that what he says here is the impact of seeing Jesus by faith, crucified in our place, victoriously risen, ascended for us, glorified. We must see Him. The word see conveys the idea of understanding, comprehending, realizing, perceiving more and more about Him. And oh, how we ought to yearn to see Him, to understand Him more, to realize who He is more, to perceive Him more, to perceive more and more Jesus dying, buried, raised, and living for us. And that is absolutely necessary. To see Him that way is absolutely necessary if we are going to consistently live for Him. And this is what will keep us from being controlled by the hosannas and by the crucify Him, crucify Him. So notice here in verse 25, we need to see Him in a way that impacts our view of self. He that loveth his life, and then we have he that hateth his life. That's two views of our own life. And we need to see Jesus in such a way that it changes our attitude toward self. If our sight of Christ does not change our attitude about self, we haven't really seen Him. So he speaks of loving ourself, and he speaks of hating ourself. The one who loves self makes self the priority. As a result, the occupations, the business, the pleasures of life are preferred above him or before him. We need to see Jesus in such a way that self is swallowed up. We need to see Him in such a way that self gets out of the way. We need to see Him in such a way that overcomes self-righteousness. I mean, the self-righteous, have they really seen Jesus Christ? No, they haven't. Not in a way they need to see Him. We need to see Him in a way that overcomes self-righteousness, self-centeredness, self-interest, self-confidence, self-indulgence, self-reliance, self-satisfaction, self-seeking, self-sufficiency. It removes all of those things out of the way. We need to see Jesus in such a way that self is given up in order to be molded and shaped, to be trained and to be taught and to be transformed and to be conformed to the image of Christ. May it be our longing to see Jesus in this way, that it impacts our view of self. We also need to see Him in a way that it leads to us serving Him with our life. A part of Jesus' answer to Philip and Andrew concerning these Greeks who wanted to see Him is verse 26. If any man serve me, let him follow me. And where I am, there shall also my servant be. If any man serve me, him will my Father honor. Again, we need to keep in mind that what Jesus says here is in relation to and in the context of we would see Jesus. And in that context, Jesus speaks of serving Him. Now there are 3 clauses there in verse 26, and each clause has either the word serve or servant in it. We, of course, are not saved by or through service, but we are saved to serve. We are saved to serve. We are saved, and from that moment we are to live our lives in the service of the one who saved us. And we need to see Jesus in order to do so. And as we see Jesus, we serve Him. And as we serve Him, we see Him. And as we see Him, the more we serve Him. And round and round and round it goes. We hear Jesus say, if any man, insert your name, serve me. If any man serve me. And then reading on, we see true service to Him summarized in the words, let him follow me. Without verse 25, there is no true service. And there is no true service without follow me. And it all goes back to seeing Christ in such a way that we serve Him. Seeing Christ in such a way that we follow Him. Seeing Him in such a way that we can't do anything else but serve Him and follow Him. Seeing Him in such a way that there is no other alternative to serving Him and to following Him. To follow means to come or go after, to accompany, to pursue. And we need to see Him in such a way that we pursue Him. It requires attention. If you're going to follow, you have to pay attention to the one you are following. And we are to see Christ in such a way that it leads to a life of following Him. It draws our attention to Him, which leads to a life of closeness to Him. It leads to a drawing near. Again, be sure of this, there is no service to the Lord separated from Him. There must be a following. It is a lifestyle of separation to Him. Follow me. To follow means to leave behind anything that would come between. Anything that would cause us to go in the opposite direction of His leading. So it is a separation from and a separation to. This lifestyle is one of belief. To follow Christ is to believe Him. We need to see Him in such a way that we believe. We believe Him. To follow Christ is to identify with Him. We need to see Him in such a way that we are compelled to identify with Him. Again, one does not serve Christ adopting their own belief system apart from Him. Our belief system must coincide with Him. It must align with Him. It is a lifestyle of imitation, a lifestyle of conformity to Christ. So we need to see Jesus in such a way that we serve Him, such a way that we get self out of the way, in such a way that it impacts our life, that it leads to a life of service. And then we need to see Jesus. This is illustrated at the house of Simon, which is what we spoke on earlier. In that house, there is mention of Jesus. There is mention of Lazarus. There is mention of Martha. There is mention of Mary. There is mention of Judas. There is mention of much people of the Jews. And every one of them that day saw Jesus. But they didn't see Him in the same way. They all saw Him. They were all there. But not in the same way. Judas saw Christ that day. And though Judas had knowledge of truth, I mean, he sat under the teaching of Christ. He's witnessed the miracles of Christ. So though he had some knowledge of truth, yet he was filled with hypocritical self-interest. He saw Christ with the physical eye, but it did not cause him to rise above himself. He's filled with self-interest. Mark it down. Those filled with self-interest, they have not seen Christ in the way they need to. There were also the much people. They too saw Christ that day. Yet they were marked by indifference. They wanted to see Lazarus. There was a hollow superficiality about them. There's also mention of Lazarus and Martha and Mary. These two saw Jesus that day. But I believe in an entirely different way. There was Martha. We read in verse 2 that Martha served. And again, I believe she served differently than she did in Luke 10. In Luke chapter 10, if you remember, she was cumbered about much serving. That is, her service pulled her away from Christ. Her service distracted her from Christ. She became overburdened with her service. She was pulled away from Him by her serving, distracted from Him by her serving. She was also, in addition to being cumbered, she was careful. That is, she was worried and anxious. And she was troubled. That is, distressed and agitated about many things. And there's the problem. Many things. Many things. But all we see here, Martha served. That's all it says. Martha served. And I believe that she saw Jesus that day in such a way that she was compelled to serve. Not only was she compelled to serve, but she had joy in serving. If serving the Lord is not joyful, you're doing it wrong. She not only had joy in her service, she enjoyed Him. Martha served. We need to see Him in such a way that we enjoy Him. If we do not enjoy Him, something's wrong. Something's terribly wrong. In that house that day was Lazarus. And we read in verse 2 that he was one of them that sat at the table with him, Jesus. Why does it mention that Lazarus was one of them? Why doesn't it mention all the others that sat at the table? It mentions Lazarus and them. Because I believe Lazarus saw Jesus differently than whoever the them are. And I believe it was the apostles. He saw Jesus in such a way that he was compelled to fellowship with Him. And there he is in communion with Christ. And there's refreshment there. There's strength there. There's encouragement there. He sees Jesus in such a way that he's drawn toward Him. That's how we need to see Him. We need to see Him in such a way that we're drawn to Him. And again, the question can be asked, do we really see Him if we're not drawn to Him? If we're not drawn to Him. Then there's Mary. She sees Him in such a way that she's compelled to worship Him. To worship Him. Seeing Christ filled her with awe, love, and appreciation, compelling her to sacrificial worship. And it's not worship if it's not sacrificial. Matthew 26, verse 7, Mark 14, verse 3, both refer to Mary as a woman having an alabaster box of ointment. And seeing Christ compelled her to give what she had. We need to see Christ in such a way that we are compelled to give what we have. Seeing Christ caused her to put more worth in Christ than her possessions. And we need to see Christ in such a way that He's above all. Seeing Christ caused her to hold her possessions very loosely. And we need to see Him in such a way. Seeing Christ calls her to treasure Him more than her pride, more than her worry about what others might think. She's just compelled to Him. Martha, Lazarus, and Mary saw Christ that day. in a way in which we need to see Him. Judas also saw Him. But Judas was filled with critical spirit. The critical spirit is not really seeing Christ in the way He needs to be seen. But Martha, Lazarus, and Mary all saw Christ that day in a way that moved them, in a way that filled them with a passion and a longing for Him. They didn't all do the same thing. Martha just served. Lazarus sat at the table. Mary. What Mary did was taken more notice of than anything else. But they all saw Christ that day in a way that caused them to have a preference for Christ. We need to see Him in that way. Martha, Lazarus, and Mary saw Christ that day in a way that left them stirred and affected. We need to see Him in a way that stirs us, in a way that affects us. Martha, Lazarus, and Mary saw Christ that day in a way that caused them to rise above self. And they saw Christ that day in a way that caused them to have great joy. They saw Christ that day in a way that caused them to relate to Him. Lazarus sat with Him. Martha served Him. Mary worshiped Him. All three. What they did that day was in relation to Christ. They related themselves to Christ. That's how we need to see Him. They saw Christ that day in a way that caused them to recognize their opportunity. Lazarus saw it as an opportunity to sit with Him. Martha saw it as an opportunity to serve Him. Mary saw it as an opportunity to anoint Him. But they all saw Christ that day in a way that caused them to recognize an opportunity concerning Him. They weren't oblivious. They weren't oblivious of what was before them. They saw Christ that day in a way that caused their day to be defined and shaped by Him. That's how they saw Him. Their day was defined by Him. Their day was shaped by Him. Martha, Lazarus, and Mary saw Christ that day in a way that gave them great peace, great strength, and enjoyment. If you were to ask Lazarus, what did you feel as you sat at the table with Christ? Oh, I felt such peace, such strength, such enjoyment. And if you were to ask Martha, Martha, what did you feel? She'd say the same thing. And Mary, the same thing. Judas saw Christ that day, but all he could do was criticize, because he didn't truly see Him as he needed to. We need to see Jesus in such a way that we serve Him. That we serve Him. That we sit with Him. And that we worship Him. And it's not one of these, or maybe the other. It's all three. We need to see Him in such a way that we serve Him, sit with Him, and worship Him. That's how we need to see Jesus. So we read in Hebrews 2 verse 9, we see Jesus. May that be so. in our life. Brother Dave, if you'd come and lead us